I went to the cafe where my wife was meeting with her hidden lover. When she saw me, she froze in despair and tried to tell me that it was a business meeting, but I knew that she was lying to me, and it was exactly at that moment that I realized, no matter how much I had dedicated myself, how much I had tried to preserve that marriage, she was no longer mine, and maybe she never would have been. The scene before me was as clear as the betrayal that ripped through my chest. She smiled before seeing me, a different smile, light, almost youthful, as if she were free of me. She was there, sitting, with her hands intertwined with his on the table. An intimate gesture, too intimate for someone who claims to be in a business meeting. There were no papers, no folders, no computer. Just 2 glasses of wine and a complicity that was strange to me. And the cruelest thing, she was happy. It was a happiness I hadn't seen in his eyes for months, maybe years. The same happiness that I tried to rescue with trips, surprises, dinners, flowers. But none of my attempts were enough. Because, deep down, she had already decided to cheat. At that moment, she didn't know what to say. He just widened his eyes like someone seeing a ghost. His mouth opened, trying to formulate any plausible explanation, but all that came out was, "It's a business meeting." I didn't respond. I just looked at her. That look didn't need words. It was the look of a man who had been stabbed and yet remained standing, without screaming, without reacting. Because the pain was so deep that silence was the only answer. The lover, disconcerted, took his hand away from hers. He tried to maintain his composure, but I had already seen him, I already knew who he was, and what he represented. The ruin. The end. The destruction of everything we built together. I returned home in silence, while she ran after me, saying that she could explain, that I was seeing everything wrong, that I had always been very jealous, very suspicious. That it didn't mean anything. That was a mistake. That it was just a conversation, a coincidence. One lie on top of another, as if I were blind, as if I didn't know your gestures, your trembling voice, your desperate attempt to make me believe in the impossible. And there I realized that the worst thing about betrayal is not the act itself, but the betrayer's effort to make us doubt ourselves. She wanted to make me feel guilty for finding out. As if I were the villain for being in that cafe. As if the mistake had been mine, for seeing her, for catching her, for not having given her time to come up with a better version. I spent nights going over every detail. The smiles that seemed innocent. Absences justified with cold excuses. The interrupted phone calls. Deleted messages. The long baths. The change in touch, kisses, hugs. Everything was there, before me a long time ago, but love blinds, hope paralyzes. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to believe she could do it. Because cheating doesn't start in bed. Betrayal begins in the heart. And hers didn't work for me anymore. The truth is, at some point, she gave up. And I continued to fight alone. Do you want to know the cruelest? The most perverse? I had everything prepared. A surprise. A gesture of love. Something I had been planning for weeks. An expensive gift. A reserved dinner. A rehearsed speech. I was going to say that I still believed in us, that I wanted to try one more time. That despite our differences, the silences, the routine, I still loved her. I was going to give it all away that night. But she had already given what was ours to another man. While I dreamed of reconciliation, she plotted escape routes. While I was making plans, she was destroying them from behind. While I believed, she betrayed me. And that destroys a man inside. Not just because of the pain. But for the ridiculous. For the humiliation of loving someone who no longer loves you. The days that followed were the longest of my life. Because the pain of betrayal is not limited to the moment of being caught. It echoes. She screams. It invades every memory, every corner of the house. The bed becomes a minefield. The walls tell stories that now seem like lies. Her smell on the pillow made me cry. the toothbrush next to mine was an affront. The photos, the letters, the love notes, they all turned into evidence of a carefully constructed hoax. And I was there, trying to pick up the pieces of myself, trying to understand when I became insufficient. And then, when I thought that everything had been destroyed, that there was nothing left but emptiness, I discovered something that made me understand that life, however cruel it may be, knows how to take revenge with surgical precision. One detail. A small forgotten object. One click. A video. An audio. A record made by me, unintentionally. A security feature that I installed myself to protect her, and that ended up protecting me from her. Because what she didn't know was that the cafe where they met was part of a network where I had implemented, months before, an internal monitoring system. And when I accessed the images to better understand what she was doing there, I discovered not only betrayal, but much more. I saw your gestures. I saw the hidden kisses. I saw the way she talked about me. How he mocked my naivety. As she said I would never have the courage to confront her. How she laughed, mockingly, saying that, a man in love has no strength. And the worst, I heard her lover saying that she just needed to hold out for a few more weeks, until he got promoted. And then, who knows, he would take over. Perhaps. If it were worth it. Perhaps. If she continued, playing the role of submissive wife correctly. This was the man she left me for. A man who saw her as a prize. A body. A step. She didn't know. She would never know. But that recording changed everything. Because now I had more than words. I had the proof. The raw truth. Naked. Indisputable. And with her, I also had control. And it was there that I stopped being a victim. Because betrayal can turn us into shards, or into blades. And I decided to cut it. But with elegance. Fairly. No screaming. No violence. Only with the precision of someone who understood that the greatest revenge is silence. The indifference. And the end. From that moment on, everything changed. The game turned. And what happened next, oh, that's what no one expected. Neither does she. Neither does he. Not even me. Because when the mask fell, it wasn't me who was exposed. It was her. She is everything she pretended to be. And the most unbelievable thing is that, if I hadn't gone to that cafe, if I had followed the original plan, today we might be celebrating our wedding anniversary. Instead, I was watching, with a glass of wine in my hand and my heart numb, as the woman I swore to love completely fell apart in the face of her own lie. But what did I do with that recording? What did she do when she discovered everything had been filmed? How did I react when I saw the desperation in her eyes, not out of regret, but out of fear? And what happened to him, the lover? Oh, you can't imagine. You don't even dream. But you'll find out. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal, on the contrary, our stories are fictional and exist to show how infidelity can destroy lives, hearts and entire families. Each narrative is a reflection of the pain that many live in silence. Get ready now, because what you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a reality check. Thomas and Isabel formed, in the eyes of others, a couple that bordered on ideal. They were beautiful together, they had a harmony that attracted attention even in silence, as if there was between them a silent language of looks and gestures that only those who love truly understand. He, a civil engineer with years of solid career, possesses a serene posture and an almost silent generosity. She, a marketing and communications specialist, known for her charisma and agile intelligence with which she captivated everyone around her. They lived in a spacious apartment, elegant without being extravagant, decorated with neutral tones and details that showed care in every corner, a gray velvet sofa where they liked to watch old movies, the collection of books organized with meticulous precision by Isabel, the framed photographs on the walls, witnesses of travels, birthdays, shared achievements. They met at a business talk and, contrary to all the statistics about relationships between busy professionals, they built a connection that didn't seem to be rushed. They talked for months before their first kiss. He said he wanted to get to know her like reading a good book, page by page, without skipping chapters. She was enchanted by it, perhaps because she was tired of rushed meetings and people who wanted everything yesterday. Isabel was not an easy woman to impress, but Thomas managed to do it simply. He sent punctual messages, remembered the names of her favorite authors, and never pressured her. Everything about him seemed safe, firm, reliable, and that, for someone like her, was always more valuable than any kind of boldness. They got married after 4 years of relationship. The wedding was small, intimate, with only the closest friends and family. Thomas's speech made tears discreetly flow from Isabel's eyes. She chose him not on impulse, but because she saw him as a partner for difficult days. He chose her because, he said, she brought color to the gray world he lived in. Life as a couple was not without its difficulties, no true marriage is. They had disagreements, especially in the early years, when their professional rhythms collided and demands arose in the details, a cancelled dinner, a postponed trip, an absence felt too much at events that should have been shared. But they grew up together. They learned to give in. And they molded each other, like patient clay molded by the hands of time. As the years went by, Thomas became more introspective. He was always reserved, but over time he started to talk even less about his emotions. He worked a lot. Isabel often saw him arrive late, exhausted, without the energy for long conversations. He sat at the dinner table and ate in silence, looking at her tenderly, but without the vivacity he had before. It wasn't lack of love, it didn't seem like coldness, it was just tiredness. She understood. At least, he tried. Meanwhile, his career advanced. Isabel had been promoted and became a project manager at one of the largest digital marketing agencies in the region. He began to travel frequently, to be in meetings with important clients, and little by little, the time between the two was reduced to hurried dinners and weekends that were often used to catch up on sleep. Still, there was affection. He hugged her from behind while she cut vegetables, kissed her forehead while she slept, made her coffee on Monday mornings. She organized his clothes before his trips, wrote sweet notes and left them hidden among his folders. They never stopped caring. But there was a silent distance that, although never spoken, was beginning to grow. It wasn't a distance caused by fights or disagreements, it was the absence of sharing. They were together, but increasingly in different worlds. On their wedding anniversaries, they made a point of celebrating. Candlelit dinners, carefully chosen gifts. But even these occasions began to feel more ceremonial than spontaneous. As if to say, it's still us, even when the evidence of this was beginning to become scarce. Friends noticed. Some close ones asked if everything was okay, to which Isabel always replied with a firm smile that yes, that love sometimes transforms and that everything is part of it. Thomas, in turn, didn't talk. He never liked to expose himself, and avoided conversations that required him to say more than he was willing to feel. But he listened. I kept everything. I watched. They had serious conversations about children. Isabel wanted it, but she always said she would only have it when she felt really stable, both financially and emotionally. Thomas, despite being silent, showed a desire to start a family, but also respected her time. They kept putting it off, until time started to get tight. And when they were finally ready, they discovered that she would have difficulty getting pregnant. The process was painful. Consultations, exams, hopes that were renewed and shattered like thin glass. Thomas tried to be strong, tried to show support, but it affected him more than he let on. Isabel cried hidden in the bathroom, feeling guilty for not being able to give him the child he wanted, even though he had never said so. The pain was not shared equally. It was as if each one carried a piece of the tragedy alone, and that separated them more than any argument. But life went on. They took a trip to try to reconnect. They went to the coast, rented a house facing the sea, and for a few days they tried to pretend that nothing had changed. They walked along the beach, ate in silence, sometimes exchanged long looks as if they wanted to say everything they couldn't say in words. She wondered if it was still enough. He wondered if he still knew how to reach her. At night, they hugged each other as if the body could heal what the soul no longer knew how to resolve. And yet, there was love. A suffering, quiet, unspectacular love, but one that resisted. The return to routine, however, cooled everything down again. And that's when Isabel started to change. Small gestures. He started getting ready for work more. He started taking longer at lunch. He returned home in a different mood. Lighter. Thomas, observant by nature, noticed. But he didn't say anything. He preferred to believe it was just a phase. That it was good to see her happy. That maybe it was a sign that things were getting back on track. She smiled more. It was more electric. I was making plans. I wanted to redecorate the apartment, change the paintings in the living room, paint one of the bedroom walls a lighter tone. And he agreed, even without enthusiasm. He saw a flame in her that he hadn't seen in a long time, and that made him believe there was still a way. In the midst of all this, he started planning a surprise. I wanted to rekindle something between them. He thought about taking her to a special restaurant, in a place that was meaningful to both of them. He reserved a table, bought flowers, wrote a letter by hand. A letter saying how much she was still the center of his world, even with time, with routine, with distance. A letter in which he completely undressed, as he hadn't done in years. I wanted to deliver that with a smile, with a confident look. I wanted to see her eyes shine like they did at the beginning. I wanted to win her back. Start over. Meanwhile, Isabel lived days of confused intensity. She felt torn between two worlds. One of them was one I knew well, comfortable, safe, full of history. The other, more recent, more instinctive, more vibrant. A world where she felt wanted in a different way. Where your opinions were listened to with admiration, where your presence made an impact. I didn't know exactly what to do with it. I didn't know how real it was. But I liked the feeling. And, above all, she felt alive. And it was in this scenario, with a heart full of intentions and another full of doubts, that the story was heading towards the point where everything would change. When the fine line between trust and doubt would be broken. When the saved words would become irreversible. When previously innocent gestures would take on another meaning. When a simple, everyday coffee table would become the stage for a devastating revelation. And yet, until that moment, there was nothing exposed. Nothing confessed. Just silent feelings, unspoken intentions, contained desires. But the truth, even silent, was already on its way. And with it, everything that was yet to happen. In the days following Thomas's planned trip, time seemed to have entered a new cadence, as if everything was on hold. He dove into the routine with a determination that mixed hope and nervousness, as if setting the stage for a reconciliation. He chose a discreet, elegant restaurant, the same one where he had proposed years before. He reserved the best table, ordered her favorite dish, ordered flowers that would be delivered minutes before Isabel arrived. In his mind, there was no doubt that that gesture would revive something dormant. He wrote a letter, not by chance. I wanted her to read it. I wanted the words to last beyond that night. He wanted that, if there was silence between them, at least the letter would speak for him. A text written calmly, full of memories, vulnerabilities and plans for a future together. No charges, just delivery. Isabel, on the other hand, was experiencing emotional turmoil. Behind the scenes of her professional routine, there was something she could no longer hide from herself. A parallel bond, born unpretentiously in meetings, coffee in the hallway and looks that became increasingly prolonged. There wasn't an exact point at which it stopped being just admiration and became desire, but the transformation was inevitable. It wasn't about love, not even passion in the romantic sense of the word. It was a disguised lack of attention. It was the adrenaline of feeling wanted, valued, heard. That was what Thomas, without knowing it, had let slip. And she, weakened by frustrations, allowed herself to be involved. His name was Daniel. An external consultant, hired to restructure the communication of an important campaign. Intelligent, self-assured, always with engaging words and a ready compliment on the tip of his tongue. He had an almost unconscious charm, that kind of presence that imposes itself even in silence. Isabel resisted at first. He set clear limits and avoided prolonging unnecessary conversations. But little by little, Daniel began to occupy spaces. A coffee after work, a ride offered on a rainy day, a message exchanged late at night under the pretext of work. Isabel felt like she was in control of the situation, that she knew exactly where she was going. And that's why he didn't realize when he crossed the line. Thomas, entwined in his own plans for reconquest, was unsuspecting. Not out of naivety, but out of choice. I preferred to believe that the distance between them was a result of tiredness, of the silent battles they faced together. That all it took was a gesture, a longer touch, a beautiful memory to rekindle the connection. And that made him persist with a tragic sweetness, like someone watering a plant that has already dried up inside. I continued to pay attention to the small details. I noticed the lipsticks she chose for work, the different perfumes, the longer silences on the cell phone. But he always found plausible justifications. Because love also means giving the benefit of the doubt, even when instinct screams otherwise. Isabel started making excuses to stretch her schedule. External meetings, urgent deadlines, company events. Daniel, always smiling, was discreet. He knew how to keep up appearances, he knew how to act as if there was nothing between them even when everything was burning inside. And that reassured her. I felt like I was in control. That it was just a phase, a distraction, a lapse that would soon be buried. But the problem with this type of lie is that it requires others, and over time, Isabel no longer knew how to separate what was truth from what was disguise. The night chosen by Thomas for the surprise arrived. He arrived at the restaurant ahead of time, arranged the last details with the manager, placed the folded letter inside her menu and asked the waiter to deliver it on time. I was nervous, but hopeful. That day, there was something different in his eyes. A contained strength, an almost adolescent expectation. He wanted to see her walk through the door and, for a second, go back to being that woman he fell in love with in the halls of a lecture. Waited for almost an hour. Isabel didn't show up. Hours earlier, she had said she would have an important meeting outside the office. Thomas believed. I trusted. While he looked at the clock and tried to contain his growing frustration, Isabel walked through the entrance of a remote cafe, hidden between corporate buildings. Discreet, she wore a dark blazer, hair tied up, light makeup. Daniel was already waiting for her at a table in the back, looking at his cell phone, with a discreet smile. She sat down in front of him, and for a few seconds she hesitated. It wasn't the first time they had met outside of a professional environment, but there was something different that day. He praised her, as he always did, and she smiled, but the smile didn't last. The feeling of guilt was beginning to throb, especially after the loving message Thomas had left on her cell phone that morning. A message she ignored. Daniel touched her hand on the table, as he always did when he wanted to break the tension. And in that moment, for the first time, she backed away. He said he didn't know if that made sense anymore. That she was feeling divided, that she didn't want to destroy what she had. Daniel listened but didn't say much. He just looked at her, with a kind of confidence that asked for no assurances. He said she needed to be honest with herself. That there was no more room for half choices. And that, instead of relieving her, destabilized her. Because for the first time, she felt pushed into a decision she didn't want to make. On the other side of town, Thomas was returning home with the letter in his pocket. He had left the flower on the restaurant table. His expression was blank. There was no anger, no apparent hurt. It was just the bitter realization that he had invested everything in a bet that might already have been lost. Upon entering the apartment, he found the environment silent. The kitchen light is on, her keys are on the counter. And the cell phone. Strangely, Isabel had forgotten her cell phone. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't the type of man to touch his wife's things. But something about that night seemed too different to ignore. When you unlocked your device, you saw notifications for a recent conversation. A name I had heard in meetings, mentioned casually, without emphasis. Daniel. The messages were there. Long, some trivial, others with clearly intimate content. And then, photos. Nothing explicit, but suggestive enough to leave no doubt. Thomas took a deep breath. He didn't throw his cell phone on the floor, he didn't scream. He just sat in the armchair in the living room with the device in his hands. She looked around and felt as if the space she lived in years ago was foreign to her now. As if he had been kicked out of his own life without warning. Isabel arrived home 2 hours later. I didn't expect to find him awake. Much less sitting in the dark of the room, with the cell phone screen still on. When he saw her, he didn't say anything. He just extended the device towards him. She froze. He swallowed hard. He looked at his cell phone, then at him. He tried to formulate some explanation, but there was no time for lies. The silence between them was the weight of everything that should never have been said. Thomas stood up slowly. He looked at her with eyes that didn't carry anger, but rather resigned pain. He said he needed to get out, breathe, think. That he would return at some point, but he didn't know when. Isabel, trembling, tried to grab his arm, but he gently pulled away. He just said, "I loved you so much." And she left, leaving behind the weight of a disappointment she never imagined she would have to carry. That morning, Isabel sat on the living room floor. Around him, everything seemed in place. The photos still hanging on the walls, the cup with the coffee she didn't finish, the books organized on the shelf. But nothing was the same anymore. Betrayal, finally, was no longer a secret kept only in the eyes. And now it was a dense, inescapable presence. A noisy void that echoed inside the house, inside her. But there was something Isabel still didn't know. Something Thomas had discovered but hadn't yet revealed. A detail, a piece that would change the course of everything that was yet to come. Something he kept not for revenge, but because he needed to be sure. And that secret, silent and devastating, was yet to explode. Thomas spent the next 2 days immersed in absolute silence. He didn't answer messages, he didn't answer calls, he didn't seek comfort from anyone. There was no thunderous anger in his gestures, nor emotional outbursts. It was a kind of pain that took hold slowly, like a leak that corrodes the strongest concrete. He stayed in a small hotel far from the center, where no one knew him, and spent most of his time walking down streets that didn't belong to him, observing strangers, as if he was looking for some distraction from the turmoil that was consuming him inside. As much as the image of Isabel in another man's arms hurt him, there was something even more disturbing that kept him awake in the early hours of the morning, the doubt of how long it would be since she was no longer his. Because cheating is not just the moment of touching, it is the silent process that precedes it, the distance that disguises itself as routine, the look that is no longer exclusive. That Saturday morning, Thomas returned to the apartment with a look that mixed firmness and exhaustion. Isabel was there, sitting on the couch as if she hadn't left since he left. The swollen eyes, the pale skin, the hunched shoulders. She stood up as soon as she saw him, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. He walked to the shelf where the picture frames were and looked, for long seconds, at a photo taken years before, at a candlelit dinner in a country town. He smiled, but it was a sad smile. He said he needed to talk, but that he wanted to be heard without interruptions. Isabel nodded, sitting back down. He said that week, he had been approached by the owner of the cafe where she used to meet with Daniel. He said he knew him because of an old project at the company he worked for, and that they had kept in touch. The cafe, now part of an expanding chain, had recently been equipped with a state-of-the-art security camera system, equipment that, ironically, he himself had recommended. I wasn't after anything. He never imagined he would need that. But, on impulse, one night when he couldn't sleep, he accessed the remote system. And he saw it. Isabel put her hand over her mouth. His breath caught in his chest. He didn't try to deny it. You didn't apologize. Silence was the only thing that made sense at that moment. Thomas continued. He said he didn't bring it up to humiliate her. That he already knew about the betrayal and that he had decided, even before seeing her in the cafe, to end everything. But something in the video caught your attention. One detail. A gesture. A moment that, at first glance, could go unnoticed, but that, for someone with a trained eye like him, said it all. In the footage, Isabel handed Daniel a white envelope. It looked like a common folder, the kind used for documents. He opened it, read it, smiled. The two toasted. And then, Daniel said something, that even without audio, from the movement of his lips, Thomas was able to decipher, "This will guarantee my promotion." At the time, that seemed strange to him. What type of document could she have submitted that was related to his promotion? In the following days, even immersed in the pain of betrayal, Thomas decided to investigate. He used his contacts, crossed dates, accessed documents that, until then, he never imagined he would need to see. And that's how he found out. The secret. The blow. Isabel had, in the previous weeks, accessed confidential reports from the company where Thomas worked. Technical and financial reports linked to a high-value project, which was under negotiation with a competing construction company. Daniel, as a consultant, had a direct interest in that information. And she had been the link. The bridge. The key he needed to stand out. She had used her intimacy with her husband to gain access to documents that were not publicly available, and handed them over to another man, not just out of emotional involvement, but out of opportunism. Maybe she believed he would actually commit to something with her. Maybe I was tricked. Or perhaps you were consciously part of a plan bigger than your own emotions. Thomas revealed all of this without raising his voice. There was no need. The words fell like stones. Isabel's face fell apart with each new sentence. He tried to deny it. He said he didn't know what he was delivering. Who thought they were just generic reports? That Daniel had said he needed examples for a market study. Thomas shook his head, disappointed. He said he knew her intelligence, and that this justification didn't fit with who she was. Or who he thought she was. She collapsed. She fell to her knees on the living room floor, asking him to believe. That yes, he had made a mistake, but he never imagined that it would cause real damage. She said she acted out of need, out of insecurity, out of vanity. That it was manipulated. That I didn't want to hurt him like that. That she still loved him. That everything had gotten out of control. Thomas then took an envelope from his pocket similar to the one he had seen in the video. She said that she had taken the situation to the company's management, that she had been transparent, that she had accepted her error as an internal failure. Who was called to a meeting with the board. And that, to protect her name, and what little was left of her dignity, he accepted to be held responsible in a symbolic way, voluntarily distancing himself from the project. He lost the bonus, the promotion, and part of the prestige built over the years. But he did this so that she would not be criminally prosecuted. So that the case could be closed there, in the silence of the corporate corridors. Isabel sobbed. She tried to touch him, but he moved away. He said that forgiveness was not something that could be offered there, in that room, under those circumstances. That love, to exist, needs respect, and that she had crossed all possible borders. That it was no longer about loving betrayal, but about trust, integrity, character. That she was lost. And that he couldn't save her anymore. She asked if there was anyone else. If he had found someone. Thomas laughed, a bitter laugh. He said that, for the first time in years, he was thinking only about himself. That there was no room for anyone at that moment. That perhaps, one day, love would knock on the door again, but that, now, what he needed most was peace. Before leaving, he gave her a copy of the dossier with the exchanged documents, the dates, and the intercepted emails. He said she could do whatever she wanted with it. Save, burn, forget. But he would never forget. Isabel stood there, alone, surrounded by all the wrong choices she made. The lover disappeared. The man she thought wanted her no longer answered her calls. There was never a future. Just one game. A board where she was a piece and a pawn. And now, with everything in ruins, he understood the price of underestimating true love. Thomas walked down the stairs of the building feeling light but not victorious. There was no victory in seeing someone you loved so much become consumed by their own flaws. There was only silence. But, deep down, something was born. The hope of reconstruction. The certainty that, no matter how devastated he was still whole. And that life, even after destruction, can still be restarted. 2 months have passed since the last conversation between Thomas and Isabel. 2 months without any word, no meeting, no nod of reconciliation. The apartment that previously served as a refuge for two now remained with just one of them, isolated, echoing memories in each room, as if each object had recorded the sound of the past. Isabel chose to leave days after that conversation. He didn't leave notes, he didn't take everything at once, he just disappeared little by little, like someone erasing the traces of their own guilt in an attempt to make the damage less visible. Thomas stayed, but not out of attachment. I needed to look at the ruins before leaving them behind. He needed to understand when he stopped seeing the woman sleeping next to him. I didn't cry anymore. There was something firm in his eyes now, something born not of anger, but of full acceptance that certain loves, even when intense, are fatal. He returned to work, albeit in another, more discreet sector, far from the large projects he previously managed. His colleagues respected silence and avoided questions, perhaps because they feared the answer. But even there, among papers and calculations, he didn't hide. He was present, lucid, focused. He used the pain as a structure to stay upright. He was no longer the same, it's true, but he had gained something he had previously lacked, clarity. He stopped wondering if it was enough, if he could have done it differently. He understood that love, when it is real, does not need to be proven every day. And that, when it fails, it is not always the fault of those who stayed, but, often, the weakness of those who chose to leave. Isabel, on the other hand, entered a silent spiral of emotional exhaustion. She tried to start her life over again in a rented apartment in a more remote neighborhood, surrounded by boxes that she refused to unpack. He resigned from the agency after realizing that his presence caused discomfort. Daniel disappeared completely after the exposure. He heard rumors that he was discreetly fired, that he tried to explain himself to the company, but they preferred to end the relationship without scandals. She was alone. And for the first time, loneliness was not a choice, it was a consequence. He avoided places where he could cross paths with acquaintances. Ignored calls from parents. She moved away from her friends. And, above all, he began to fear the mirror. Not out of vanity, but because he couldn't bear to see a reflection of the woman he had become. On a cold Saturday morning, Thomas decided to leave town for a few days. He got in the car and drove for hours, without a specific destination, until he stopped in a small coastal town where they had spent a weekend many years ago. He rented a simple room facing the sea and spent his days walking along the beach, breathing in the sea air as if he wanted to cleanse his body from the inside. On one of these walks, he found a lady selling paintings in front of a gallery. He noticed one painting in particular, an open window with curtains blowing in the wind and the sea in the background. The lady, without asking, said, "Sometimes opening a window is more difficult than closing a door." Thomas bought the painting and, for the first time in a long time, he truly smiled. That symbolic gesture moved him. It was as if, in that painting, there was a reminder that moving forward is not about erasing what you have experienced, but allowing yourself to experience something new. Upon his return, after his third month away, he found a hand-addressed envelope in the lobby of his building, with his handwriting. It was Isabel's. Inside, a letter. Short, straightforward, written with pain and courage. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he needed to talk. That he still carried remorse, that he now understood what he had lost. And that, more than anything, he wanted to talk. One last time. Eyes to eyes. To end with dignity what he had destroyed with disloyalty. Thomas thought, reread, left the letter on the table for 2 days, until he decided that yes, they deserved closure. Not for her. For him. The meeting was arranged in a discreet park, in the late afternoon. The gray skies seemed to match the mood of the occasion. She arrived first, sitting on a wooden bench, wrapped in a dark coat, her hair tied up, her face thinner. When she saw him, she got up immediately, but he remained still for a few seconds, watching. There was no contempt in his gaze, but there was no tenderness either. It was a clean, hard and definitive look. She started talking. He said he thought about every detail of that night. Who heard his own words 1,000 times and they all seemed empty to him. That he didn't sleep well. That he had sought professional help. That he now understood that he had betrayed not only a man, but a future. That her betrayal was more than a physical or emotional act. It was a surrender to an inner cowardice that she had never faced before. He said that, for years, he held the idea that he deserved more. Which was undervalued. But he understood, too late, that those who don't value themselves can never recognize the value they receive. And cried. But not with the hope of moving. Finally he cried. By conscience. Thomas heard her. In silence. With straight posture and fixed eyes. When she finished, he just replied that there was no more pain. There was overcoming. That the wound was now a scar. That his time with her was over. And that, although he still respected the history they had, he no longer saw room for any attempt at reconstruction. He said he didn't hate it. And that was worse for her. Because indifference is the final stage of liberation. He also said that he met someone in the last few days. Someone who didn't replace, but who awakened something dormant in him. There was no rush, there were no certainties, but there was a desire. And that alone, meant everything. Isabel silently nodded. Didn't contest. He didn't beg. Just thanked him for coming. For listening to her. And he said goodbye with a restrained hug. When he walked away, she remained sitting for a few minutes, looking at the sky that was beginning to darken. That was the end. An end without explosions, without screams, without appeals. But also no return. The following week, Thomas returned to the company with a new spirit. He participated in a meeting where he was invited to take on a new project abroad, with a deadline of 6 months. Considered, reflected and accepted. I needed a change of scenery, expanding my horizons. He changed the apartment, sold furniture, kept only the essentials. Among the few things he took was the window frame. And the letter he wrote to Isabel but never delivered. A letter where he said everything he felt before discovering the betrayal. He never delivered because he understood that he didn't need to say anything anymore. That loving is also knowing how to stop. And that sometimes stopping is the bravest act of all. Before boarding, he received a message from a woman he had met weeks before, on a training course. Marcella, art teacher, sensitive, fun, with a calmness that contrasted with the chaos he had experienced. She invited him for coffee. Nothing else. A meeting without pretension. And he responded with a smile on his face. He said he was about to board, but would love to have that coffee when he got back. Perhaps, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to write a new chapter, this time, with actual blank pages. No ghosts, no shadows, no past hidden in your pocket. Just true. And the desire to love again. Thomas's farewell to the city was not marked by grand speeches or symbolic ceremonies. The suitcase he carried was light, practical, carefully thought out. No objects that smell of the past, no old letters, no physical reminders of what once was. He kept what he needed, including the window frame and some bedside books, the same ones that always accompanied him in times of transition. At the airport, while waiting for the flight that would take him to the next 6 months of work on another continent, he felt a strange mixture of lightness and vertigo. It wasn't an escape. It was not an attempt to erase what he experienced. It was just the conscious choice to no longer be a prisoner of what I couldn't change. Outside, the rain was hitting the glass with some insistence, but he just watched in silence, as if the world was starting to slow down for the first time in a long time. During the flight, he read half of a book he bought the day before, an introspective novel about loss and rebuilding. He stopped at a sentence and stared at the text for minutes. The heart heals at the same speed at which it learns to love itself again. That crossed him like an intimate truth. Not about forgetting Isabel, not about denying everything they lived, but about admitting that the pain no longer shaped his steps. It became just a page, painful but closed. And that, in itself, was liberating. Upon arriving at the destination, he was welcomed by a small team from the project's partner company. They accommodated him in a simple, functional flat, where the silence was constant and time seemed to run slower. There, far from familiarity, he found space to listen to himself. The routine was productive, challenging, engaging. He worked with professionals from different parts of the world and, even with different accents and rhythms, they found a rare professional harmony. They weren't close friends, but there was respect, and that was enough. In his free time, he walked through the narrow streets of the old city, discovered hidden cafes, read on benches in unfamiliar squares and, for the first time in years, slept without the feeling of a weight on his chest. One day, in the middle of one of these walks, he received a message from Marcella. She said that she had participated in an exhibition with her students and that one of the works was inspired by a conversation they had in the cafe. He said he had missed him, but that he understood his time. Thomas read the message with a slight smile. He replied that he wanted to see the exhibition when he returned and asked about the painting. She responded with a photo. It was an abstract canvas, shades of blue and yellow intertwined, forming what appeared to be an opening spiral. The title was Fresh Start. In the caption, just one sentence, because there is no way back where there is no more road. They continued exchanging messages over the months, without rushing, without charging. They talked about books, travel, art, small everyday situations. There was a complicity growing there, silent and solid, built on truth and respect. Thomas didn't declare himself, he didn't promise anything, but little by little, he made it clear that something new was emerging on the horizon. Meanwhile, Isabel headed in another direction. After the conversation in the park, he began an intense process of self-knowledge. He sought therapy, regained contact with his family, faced judgmental looks, veiled criticism, and awkward silences. She began to get involved with volunteer projects at an institution that welcomed women in vulnerable situations. Not as a form of cheap redemption, but because I needed to give new meaning to my own presence in the world. He started writing. It started with personal texts, outbursts that I would never show to anyone. Then, short chronicles, reflections on guilt, forgiveness, choices. On one of those writing afternoons, she was surprised by a phone call. It was his father, who he hadn't spoken to in months. He said he was reading a text published in an online column, a chronicle signed by Isadora L. She said there was something in that writing that seemed to be hers. And it was. Isabel published under a pseudonym, not out of shame, but out of fear that she was not ready to be heard. The father, moved, just said, "I'm happy to recognize you again." She cried after that call. Not out of sadness, but because I realized that, little by little, I was finding parts of myself that I thought I had lost forever. In the 5th month of Thomas's exchange, the company invited him to give a lecture on emotional management in times of crisis. He hesitated to accept. He was never one to talk about himself in public, especially about intimate issues. But he accepted. He took the stage with shaking hands, but with a steady gaze. He talked about how great losses redefine our contours. About how it is possible to rebuild an identity without denying pain. About how love doesn't end, it just changes shape. The auditorium fell silent. At the end, he received a standing ovation. A woman from the organization approached and said, "Your words were more honest than many truths I have heard in recent years." He thanked her humbly and left feeling, for the first time, that his story was not just his. It was also a support point for those who were still sinking. When he returned to the country, he found the apartment empty as he had left it, but something inside it had changed. There was no longer any shadow in the rooms. There was space. And space, now, meant possibility. Marcella welcomed him with a simple dinner, prepared by her. They talked for hours, laughed, got emotional. They made no promises, but they looked at each other with a kind of tenderness that required no words. When she left a note on the table, "I don't know what we are, but I like what we are." The following Sunday, Thomas returned to the park where he had said goodbye to Isabel. He sat on the same bench. He observed the movement, the couples, the children running. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt whole. Not immune to pain, but strengthened by it. He took out his cell phone and wrote one last message to Isabel: "I don't hold you in a grudge. I leave you where you need to be, in the past. I hope you're finding your way too." He pressed send and put the device in his pocket. There, under the clear sky, he understood that freedom is not about forgetting, it is about stopping wishing it had been different. And at that exact moment, he realized that he was ready to experience what was yet to come. Not because I needed to. But because I wanted to. Because he deserved it. Because I was finally at peace. It was early spring when Thomas decided to leave the country once again, but now not for work, nor to escape. It was by choice, by pure desire for change. He sold the apartment, handed over the few pieces of furniture that remained, donated books, closed accounts, and, without telling many people, left with a backpack and a new address on his passport. This time, he didn't say goodbye to anyone, neither to what he was, nor to who he was. "I was going not to forget, but to make room for what was to come." Marcella followed part of the process, without trying to occupy a place that didn't belong to her, but, at the same time, without giving up being by his side. She was a woman who didn't demand, didn't beg, just allowed herself to be where it made sense. And at that moment, it did. In southern Europe, Thomas found refuge in a seaside village, where the streets were narrow and the days seemed longer. He worked as a remote consultant and, in his free time, wrote. He began recording his experiences in small notebooks, then started publishing them on a personal blog, which quickly gained readers around the world. He did not present himself as a victim, nor as a hero. He talked about new beginnings, about silent reconstructions, about the days when the pain suddenly tightens and those that arrive with unexpected lightness. His words went through people because they didn't ask for pity, they asked for empathy. And without realizing it, he became a reference for those who were looking, in the midst of destruction, for a ray of light. Months later, he received an unexpected message from an editor who followed his blog. They wanted to transform the texts into a book. Initially he was reluctant, but ended up accepting. The process was intense. Relive everything, rewrite, reorganize emotions on paper. But it was liberating. The book was released the following autumn, with the title, What Remains When Everything Goes Away. And it became, against all expectations, a success. Invitations to lectures, interviews, events. But Thomas kept a low profile. He refused media appearances. He preferred his words to speak for him. He never named names, never pointed out culprits. Just wrote. And when he wrote, he healed. Meanwhile, Isabel reaped the fruits of the silence that she herself sowed. She moved to a smaller city, starting over from scratch in a place where she was not known. He tried to return to the job market, but the scars of his history made everything more difficult. People didn't know the details, but her gaze carried a weight that removed any attempt at closeness. He began teaching creative writing classes at a public school. The students, restless teenagers hungry for expression, were his new anchor. He told stories, encouraged the truth, said that everyone has the right to make mistakes, but that what defines a person is what they do afterwards. At home, I lived alone. Some nights I drank too much wine, others I wrote compulsively. He never got involved with anyone again. Not out of fear, but because he understood that there was a hole in himself that was too deep to be filled by anyone else. I needed to learn to live with it. His texts, previously hidden, began to be published under his real name. One of them, Letter to Who I Was, went viral. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was raw. He said, I betrayed those who loved me, and it wasn't just with another body. I betrayed them with my absence, my cowardice, my vanity. And today I live with the exact measure of what was left, silence, and a mirror that doesn't lie. It was shared by thousands, cited in articles, used in lectures. She never made any money from it, but she did make something rarer, truth. And in the midst of pain, she rebuilt herself. Daniel, in turn, disappeared from the business scene. After being dismissed without official justification, he tried to get back on his feet, but his name carried noise. It was learned that he had tried to replicate the same pattern with another woman, in another company, and was exposed for doing so. Rumors suggested that he had left the country, trying to start from scratch somewhere else. But no one was sure. It became a name that people mentioned dismissively in backstage conversations. The kind of man who uses charm as currency and discards everything when it loses its value. Isabel never looked for him again. He deleted the number, deleted photos, burned memories. Not out of anger, but out of understanding that he was just the trigger. It was her choice. And the consequences too. Marcella continued her life with the same serenity she always had. He continued teaching, participating in exhibitions, living with balance. She was not a woman who idealized love, but who recognized when something was special. And with Thomas, it was. When he wrote to her saying he wanted her to visit him in the village where he was living, she didn't hesitate. He arrived on a blue morning, carrying a small suitcase and a book of poetry in his hands. He was waiting for her on the porch, with brewed coffee and fresh bread. They sat in silence. Then they looked at each other. And they hugged. And in that embrace there was more than affection, there was rest. In the years that followed, they built a relationship without labels, but full of meanings. They traveled together, but they also knew how to move away when they needed space. They laughed a lot. They shared readings. They touched each other delicately. They loved each other calmly. There were no promises of eternity, but there was presence. And that was enough. One afternoon, Thomas received a letter from Isabel. A simple sheet, handwritten. She said she had read his book. Who cried? Who laughed? That hurt. But it was beautiful. And that, despite everything, she was happy that he had found peace. You apologized once again, not for what you caused, that had already been said, but for the version of you he knew. He ended by saying that if they ever met by chance, he would like to be able to smile without guilt. He didn't respond. But he kept the letter fondly. Not out of nostalgia. But out of respect for what was. Life went on. With new landscapes, new stories, new pains and joys. But now, with a serene certainty, true love is not the one that never makes mistakes. It is what survives loss. And what, even in silence, continues to teach. If you've made it this far, tell me, what did you think of this story? What marked you the most? Do you believe it is possible to start over after betrayal? Comment below, I really want to know your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our mission is to show how it can destroy lives, but also how it is possible to rebuild them with truth, respect and courage. Until next time.